Welcome to Luxurious Tales. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Marianne Hale's life ran on precision long before it ever ran on hope. Her mornings began before sunrise in a narrow Boston apartment that smelled faintly of coffee beans and old paper, where spreadsheets waited like obedient soldiers and running shoes rested by the door. As a forensic accountant, Marianne lived inside numbers that told uncomfortable truths, embezzlements hidden behind polite smiles, missing funds masked by clever formatting. Yet beyond the rigor of her profession, she carried quieter rituals, long-distance runs along the Charles River to steady her thoughts, evenings spent cataloging vintage cookbooks she never cooked from, dreaming instead of one day managing a calm neighborhood coffee and bakery built on honesty and order. Her mother, Eloise Hale, watched these routines with gentle concern, often reminding her that people who chased applause rarely learned how to be faithful to silence. That warning echoed the evening Marianne attended a charity housing committee meeting, sent by her firm to observe compliance practices. The room buzzed with polite ambition until Wesley Hart stood to speak. He wasn't famous, not yet, but his presence drew attention effortlessly, measured confidence, clean arguments, and a voice trained to persuade without sounding desperate. He spoke of sustainable growth and responsible planning, and Marianne noticed how he paused before answering questions, as if weighing truth against ambition. Their eyes met briefly across the table, not with romance, but recognition, two people who believed structure could control chaos. Wesley noticed her too, the way she listened without flattery, the way her questions cut straight to the core without hostility. That same week, Daphne Rowe returned from New York, sliding back into Marianne's life like a perfectly timed interruption. They had been inseparable once, college roommates bound by late-night conversations and shared survival, but adulthood had sharpened their differences. Daphne was all bold laughter and calculated entrances, an event planner who thrived on rooms full of powerful people and the thrill of being noticed. Marianne welcomed her with genuine warmth, though she sensed the old imbalance resurface. Daphne admired Marianne's stability while quietly resenting it. Over dinner, Daphne spoke of influence and reinvention, while Marianne spoke of balance and patience. The affection between them was real, but so was the dormant jealousy that neither woman named, unaware it would soon find its moment to breathe. The next time Marianne saw Wesley Hart was at a community open house event for a mixed-use housing proposal in a renovated brick hall near the waterfront. She had come on her own time, curious rather than obligated, drawn by the chance to understand how civic promises translated into real structures. Wesley was already there, sleeves rolled just enough to seem approachable, explaining zoning details to a skeptical couple. When Marianne asked a pointed question about contingency reserves and tenant protections, he didn't deflect. Instead, he smiled, genuinely impressed, and answered with clarity that suggested preparation rather than performance. The exchange lingered, not flirtatious but electric, as if both recognized a shared respect for substance over noise. Rowan Price was less charmed when Marianne mentioned Wesley later that night. Over dinner in his modest apartment, sawdust still clinging to his sleeves from a woodworking project, Rowan listened carefully and then leaned back, eyes narrowing. He had spent years defending people misled by smooth talkers and contracts they didn't fully understand. Charm is a tool, he said evenly, not accusing but firm. Some people use it to build bridges. Others use it to distract while they take something. Marianne bristled at the caution, insisting Wesley hadn't dodged her questions. Rowan didn't argue, he simply reminded her that the most dangerous persuasion often felt reasonable, even kind. Across town, Daphne observed the budding connection from a distance, her smile perfectly composed as she watched Marianne glow with unfamiliar anticipation. Later, in a quiet restaurant booth with her Aunt Pearl Linwood, Daphne dropped the pretense. She spoke of Marianne's steadiness as if it were a luxury item she herself had never been given, of men who noticed calm women too late. Pearl listened, stirring her drink slowly, and Daphne's voice hardened. "I won't be second choice anymore," she said, not naming anyone but meaning everything. Pearl nodded approvingly, already thinking in strategies, while Daphne looked back toward the future with resolve that had little room for loyalty. Dinner at the Hale home unfolded with the quiet warmth Marianne had grown up trusting. Eloise Hale moved through the small kitchen with practiced ease, setting down plates while asking Wesley thoughtful questions that weren't meant to impress but to understand. Rowan joined them at the table, polite yet unfiltered, his posture relaxed but his attention sharp. Conversation drifted to childhoods, to work, and then, carefully, to Marianne's father, whose absence lingered like an old bruise no one pressed too hard. Eloise spoke gently about resilience and choice, about how people revealed themselves not in grand gestures but in consistency. Wesley listened respectfully, yet Marianne noticed how he straightened when Rowan mentioned integrity as something that cost you something real. The contrast was unmistakable when Marianne later attended dinner with the Harts. Graham Hart presided over the table with crisp authority, every sentence edged with expectation. He spoke of legacy as if it were an inheritance earned only through relentless discipline, not compassion. Wesley leaned forward often, eager to demonstrate alignment, his words polished and deferential. Trina Hart intervened when tension surfaced, smoothing conversations with practiced warmth, her smiles a soft buffer against her husband's severity. Marianne felt welcomed but measured, as though she were being evaluated against invisible criteria. She left that evening sensing that approval in this family was conditional, something granted for performance rather than presence. In the weeks that followed, Daphne's presence became increasingly noticeable, slipping seamlessly into Marianne's expanding world. She offered to coordinate casual gatherings, suggested double dinners, and positioned herself as a helpful bridge between families and friends. Wesley seemed grateful for her efficiency, while Marianne appreciated the familiarity Daphne brought into unfamiliar spaces. Yet beneath the helpfulness was calculation. Daphne remembered details Marianne forgot, spoke to Graham with practiced confidence, and learned Wesley's preferences quickly. No one objected, it all seemed supportive, even generous. Still, something subtle shifted, as Daphne embedded herself deeper, turning proximity into access with a precision that felt intentional rather than accidental. The coastal weekend in Maine began as a deliberate pause, a chance to breathe outside Boston's clipped schedules and fluorescent-lit rooms. Wesley rented a modest sailboat through a local instructor he knew from lessons, insisting the simplicity was the point. The salt air sharpened everything: voices, thoughts, expectations. He showed Marianne how to tie basic knots, laughing when the rope slipped from her fingers, patient as she tried again. The water rocked gently beneath them, and for the first time since meeting him, Marianne felt the future stretch open without pressure. There were no presentations, no committees, just horizon, wind, and the illusion of time slowing down enough to be trusted. That evening, wrapped in thick sweaters on the dock, Marianne spoke about her fear of abandonment in a way she rarely allowed herself to. She told Wesley about her father's disappearance, how financial collapse had preceded emotional absence, and how she learned early that stability could vanish without warning. Wesley listened intently, his confidence softening into something that felt sincere. He spoke of wanting permanence, of building something that didn't wobble at the first sign of difficulty. His promises were measured, not grand, and that steadiness calmed her. Marianne believed him, not because he sounded perfect, but because he sounded intentional, like someone who understood the cost of breaking trust. The weekend might have remained unblemished if not for Daphne's interruptions. Her calls came sporadically, framed as planning emergencies that couldn't wait: vendor confirmations, seating questions, introductions Wesley really should handle personally. Each time, Wesley stepped away briefly, returning apologetic and distracted. Marianne brushed it off, trusting Daphne's role and Wesley's transparency. Yet something faintly unsettled her, a sense that private conversations were forming parallel threads she couldn't see. Daphne's voice lingered on the line longer than necessary, her tone familiar, almost proprietary. By the time Marianne noticed the pattern, the boat had already docked, and the moment had passed, filed away as harmless, though it refused to fully fade. The proposal arrived without spectacle, which was precisely why it unraveled Marianne so completely. Wesley chose a quiet bookstore cafe tucked between brick buildings and ivy-covered windows, a place where conversations were murmured and time felt respectful. They had spent the afternoon browsing shelves, debating titles, when he reached across the small wooden table and spoke plainly about partnership, about choosing someone who made ambition feel grounded rather than frantic. When he produced the ring, simple, deliberate, unmistakably thoughtful, Marianne felt the weight of her guarded years loosen. She said yes with a voice that shook, not from doubt, but from relief at being chosen without competition or performance. Daphne took control of the engagement dinner almost immediately, offering her services with enthusiasm that felt generous on the surface. She curated guest lists, coordinated vendors, and handled schedules with a fluency that impressed Wesley's expanding circle. Soon, she was indispensable, the connective tissue between families, colleagues, and friends. Marianne appreciated the support, unaware of how access compounds quietly. Daphne learned who mattered to Wesley, who flattered him best, and which rooms he wanted to enter next. Each success placed her closer to the center, not as a guest, but as a fixture, someone whose presence was expected, even relied upon. It was at that dinner that Harriet Sloane first entered their lives, elegant and watchful, her interest calibrated rather than curious. She spoke to Wesley about scale, about acceleration, about opportunities that rewarded decisiveness. Her compliments were specific, her questions pointed, and her gaze lingered just long enough to suggest potential alliances. Marianne sensed the shift in energy immediately, the way ambition tightened Wesley's posture, the way Harriet's approval felt like currency. Daphne noticed it too, her smile sharpening as she watched Harriet's attention settle. No one named it then, but the rulebook had quietly changed, and the game had just begun. Marianne first noticed the inconsistencies on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind defined by reheated dinner and quiet fatigue. Wesley talked through a recent project update while loosening his tie, mentioning revised figures with casual confidence. The numbers didn't alarm her at first, fluctuations were normal in development work. But something about the way he glossed over contingencies made her pause. She asked gently, not accusing, whether the reserves had been adjusted or merely reclassified. Wesley laughed it off, blaming industry chaos and fast-moving negotiations, assuring her everything was within reason. Marianne nodded, but the explanation sat oddly, like a puzzle piece forced into place. The unease followed her to work the next day, where Nora Keene noticed Marianne's distraction during a routine review. Over lunch, Marianne mentioned the budget shifts in passing, careful not to sound suspicious. Nora didn't overreact, but her expression sharpened with professional instinct. She spoke candidly about real estate finance, about how easily optimism could blur into risk when paperwork lagged behind promises. Never mix marriage with unsigned commitments, Nora warned quietly, not as a cynic but as someone who had seen too many people burned by trust layered over incomplete facts. Marianne absorbed the advice, telling herself it was only caution, not concern. Elsewhere, Daphne met Harriet Sloane for coffee in a private dining room arranged through Aunt Pearl's connections. The conversation was smooth, almost rehearsed. Daphne spoke of her access, gala planners, donor lists, social circles that opened doors money alone couldn't. Harriet listened, intrigued, recognizing the leverage in Daphne's proximity to Wesley. They discussed opportunities obliquely, never naming terms, only potential. Daphne left the meeting energized, convinced she had positioned herself advantageously. She didn't consider the cost yet, only the momentum, unaware that the smallest lie, once accepted, rarely remained alone. The wedding unfolded like a carefully constructed illusion, every detail polished until it reflected light back at itself. Daphne orchestrated the day with clinical brilliance, timelines penned, cues whispered, smiles deployed on command. Marianne moved through it buoyed by belief, feeling wrapped in certainty as vows were exchanged beneath a glass canopy that caught the afternoon sun. She trusted the order of things, trusted the way Wesley's hand felt steady in hers, trusted that love, when planned with care, could be durable. Friends applauded, families nodded approval, and for a few suspended hours, the future seemed as clear as the sky overhead. The reception brought the first hairline fracture. Graham Hart raised his glass with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, offering a toast that sounded congratulatory but landed with an edge. He spoke of choosing wisely, of alliances that strengthened reputation and discipline that kept families upright. The implication, that Marianne had been chosen and should be grateful, hung unspoken but present. Rowan stiffened, catching the tone immediately, his jaw tightening as he watched Marianne absorb the words with grace she had learned young. Trina smoothed the moment with applause, but the chill lingered, thin and unmistakable. Later, in a quiet corridor behind the ballroom, Daphne and Wesley crossed paths away from the crowd. Their exchange was brief, no words overheard, but the look they shared carried familiarity, a charged recognition that felt out of place on a day built for clarity. Daphne's smile softened into something private. Wesley's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. When they rejoined the celebration separately, nothing appeared amiss. Laughter resumed, music swelled, and the moment slipped unnoticed into memory, dismissed as stress, filed away as nothing. Yet glass, once stressed, remembers where it was bent. Marianne settled into marriage with the same discipline she brought to her work, believing consistency could outpace uncertainty. Evenings blurred into late dinners as Wesley's schedule thickened with site visits and meetings, and she adapted without resentment, becoming the quiet constant beneath his accelerating pace. She kept her job, not out of mistrust but pride, and soon found herself organizing household finances with an efficiency that steadied them both. When Wesley came home exhausted, she listened, asked clarifying questions, and offered structure instead of judgment. In private moments, she told herself this was what partnership looked like: support without erasure, ambition anchored by care. The first major development deal arrived like a milestone wrapped in pressure. Harriet Sloane's backing promised scale and speed, but her terms arrived dense with conditions that felt less like safeguards and more like levers. Wesley presented the opportunity with rehearsed enthusiasm, emphasizing growth and visibility, glossing over clauses he claimed were standard. Marianne asked to review them later. Wesley deferred, citing deadlines and trust. He assured her he had it handled, that hesitation could cost them momentum. She agreed to wait, uneasy but unwilling to undermine him at a critical juncture, not yet sensing how omission could be as consequential as deceit. Beckett Shaw re-entered Wesley's orbit at precisely the wrong moment, bringing with him a familiar swagger and the language of shortcuts. Over post-work drinks, he framed risk as inevitability and compromise as strategy, scoffing at caution as a luxury for people without ambition. "Everyone does it," he said, voice low and confident. "You want the top or not?" Wesley didn't answer immediately, but the question lingered, tempting and corrosive. Brick by brick, the foundation was rising, but some materials were chosen for speed, not strength, and the cracks were learning where to grow. Daphne's presence in Marianne's daily life intensified with a familiarity that felt supportive on the surface and intrusive beneath it. She suggested gym meetups that turned into long conversations about Wesley's schedule, lunches that drifted toward questions about upcoming meetings, investors, and pressures he faced. Daphne framed her curiosity as concern, positioning herself as a confidant who wanted to help Marianne keep things balanced. Marianne appreciated the attention during moments of loneliness, unaware that each answer offered Daphne a clearer map of Wesley's world, his stress points, his ambitions, and the spaces where reassurance could be mistaken for intimacy. The unease sharpened one afternoon when Marianne overheard Daphne refer to Wesley by a private nickname while recounting a planning detail. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, but it was specific, familiar, and too practiced to be accidental. Marianne paused, eyebrows lifting in mild surprise. Daphne laughed easily, waving it away. "He told me once during the wedding planning," she said, dismissive and charming. "You know how stressed he was. I was just trying to keep things light." Marianne nodded, embarrassed by her own reaction, yet the explanation failed to settle. The nickname lingered in her thoughts, a small trespass that felt larger than it looked. Meanwhile, Rowan began hearing whispers through his professional circles, casual mentions of Harriet Sloane's firm, stories of leverage disguised as opportunity. He didn't alarm Marianne, but he started quietly digging, requesting public records and scanning transaction patterns with a lawyer's patience. What he found wasn't illegal, just aggressive, structures designed to bind people tightly before they understood the cost. Rowan sensed Wesley was being shaped, nudged into dependence by invisible hands. And though he couldn't yet name Daphne's role in it, he felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the warning instinct of someone who had seen trust weaponized before. Wesley's interview appeared in a respected business magazine one crisp morning, his photograph cleanly lit, his words trimmed into confidence by an editor who knew how to sell momentum. He wasn't a celebrity, not yet, but the attention landed with weight. Colleagues congratulated him, investors called, and strangers recognized him at networking events. Marianne read the article twice, proud and unsettled in equal measure. The Wesley on the page spoke in decisive phrases about vision and inevitability, language that sounded practiced rather than lived. Success, she realized, had introduced a mirror that reflected not who he was, but who he wanted to become. In the evenings that followed, Marianne watched Wesley rehearse for upcoming appearances, pacing their living room and testing sound bites aloud. His voice sharpened when he spoke about scale and leadership, smoothing over doubts with slogans that felt foreign to their private conversations. When Marianne gently reminded him of the values he once emphasized, transparency, patience, people, he bristled. "You're being too cautious," he said, not unkindly but firmly, as though caution itself were a flaw to outgrow. The distance between them wasn't loud or cruel, it was subtle, measured in missed pauses and answers delivered too quickly. Daphne, by contrast, reveled in the shift. She circulated the article with pride, tagging influential contacts and praising Wesley's rise as if it were her own accomplishment. At a small dinner arranged by Aunt Pearl, Daphne glowed with purpose as Pearl leaned close and spoke in a tone meant only for her. "Now," Pearl urged, eyes sharp with calculation. "Don't hesitate when the door opens." Daphne nodded, emboldened, her gaze fixed on a future she believed was finally aligning. She didn't see the cost yet, only the invitation, and she had never been one to wait outside. The gala unfolded inside a restored historic hall, its high ceilings strung with warm lights and polished stone floors reflecting ambition dressed as generosity. Daphne moved through the space with effortless authority, headset tucked discreetly away, guiding donors and speakers as if she owned the night. Marianne arrived early to support Wesley, wearing quiet elegance that didn't compete for attention. Harriet Sloane's circle tightened around Wesley almost immediately, investors with practiced smiles, questions that tested loyalty as much as competence. Applause came easily, and with each round, Wesley's posture lifted, his voice deepening as he absorbed the validation like oxygen. As the evening progressed, Marianne drifted toward the balcony to catch her breath, only to overhear Harriet speaking to Wesley in a low, intimate register meant to sound friendly. Harriet implied obligations that extended beyond capital, introductions, preferences, timing, things owed but never written down. Wesley smiled tightly, nodded, and reached for another drink, the ice clinking too loudly in the glass. Marianne watched the exchange from a distance, unsettled by how quickly gratitude had slid into indebtedness. The room buzzed with laughter, but beneath it she sensed pressure mounting, a transaction forming without witnesses. Later, when Wesley failed to meet her near the stage as planned, Marianne began to search. She checked the side corridors, the service hallway, the quiet lounge reserved for organizers. After several minutes, she spotted Daphne and Wesley emerging separately from a curtained area, both adjusting their composure with practiced ease. Daphne laughed a little too brightly, Wesley avoided Marianne's eyes for a second too long. They offered separate explanations, logistics, donor questions, timing mishaps, that aligned just enough to sound plausible. Marianne accepted them publicly, applauded with the crowd, and told herself nothing had happened. But the applause felt thinner now, as though the night had swallowed something it would not return. Marianne discovered the unfamiliar transfers on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind meant for rest and recalibration. She had opened their shared financial dashboard to reconcile routine expenses, expecting predictability. Instead, several line items caught her eye, amounts moved between accounts with descriptions that felt deliberately vague. They weren't catastrophic sums, but they were frequent, patterned, and timed to coincide with recent meetings Wesley had mentioned only in passing. When she asked him later, carefully neutral in tone, he explained them away as temporary liquidity moves tied to project pacing. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and promised clarity once things settled. The explanation sounded rehearsed, but not false enough to confront. The discomfort followed her into the office the next day, where Nora Keene noticed Marianne's unusually tight focus during a review session. When Marianne shared what she'd seen, again, cautiously, Nora's response was immediate and professional. She pulled out a notepad and began mapping the pattern, pointing out how the transfers aligned with leverage building strategies rather than cash flow management. "This isn't random," Nora said quietly. "Someone is positioning assets to control outcomes later." She warned Marianne that the danger wasn't only loss, but entanglement, being linked to decisions she didn't authorize. The words landed like paper cuts, small, precise, and increasingly painful. That evening, Rowan met Silas Crown through a mutual acquaintance at a neighborhood bar known more for conversation than spectacle. Silas listened without interruption as Rowan described the broad outlines: ambition, influence, an investor with a reputation for binding people tightly. Silas finally spoke, his tone measured by experience. "Harriet's deals," he said, "could elevate or erase, depending on who held the documentation when things turned." "Men don't fall because they aim high," Silas warned. "They fall because they mistake patience for weakness." Rowan left with a sense of urgency and a strategy forming, while Marianne, at home, stacked documents into neat piles, understanding now that the damage wasn't loud. It was precise. Marianne arrived at the private lounge earlier than planned, carrying a small, carefully chosen gift meant to mark Wesley's milestone without spectacle. Daphne had insisted on organizing the celebration, framing it as a surprise that required precision timing. The lounge was dim and elegant, its leather chairs arranged for intimacy rather than crowds. As Marianne paused near the entrance to adjust her coat, she heard laughter, familiar, unguarded. Through a partial partition, she saw Daphne already seated close to Wesley, her posture relaxed, one hand resting briefly on his sleeve as if it belonged there. The sight froze Marianne in place, her pulse thudding louder than the music. She watched, unseen, as their conversation unfolded with an ease that unsettled her more than any overt gesture could have. Daphne leaned in, laughing softly, her eyes fixed on Wesley's face while he spoke. He smiled back with a comfort Marianne recognized, one that usually followed long familiarity. The proximity was wrong, the timing worse. Daphne's fingers traced the rim of her glass while Wesley spoke animatedly about pressures and choices, and Marianne realized with a sick clarity that this was not a first conversation. It was a continuation. The room felt suddenly smaller, air thinning as Marianne pressed herself against the wall, invisible and shaking. Marianne didn't confront them. She didn't step forward or interrupt or announce her presence. Instead, she stayed hidden, listening as Wesley's tone shifted from celebratory to reflective. He spoke about regrets in vague terms, about paths taken too quickly, about how timing shaped everything. Daphne murmured responses designed to soothe and encourage, her smile widening when Wesley's voice softened. Marianne felt the ground beneath her certainty fracture, not in one clean break but in splintering lines that spread silently. When she finally slipped away, unnoticed and steady on the outside, she understood something irrevocable had already begun, and it was no longer waiting for her consent. Marianne lingered in the shadowed corridor adjoining the lounge, the hum of conversation dulling into a distant throb as she pressed herself against the cool wall. She hadn't planned to stay. Instinct alone kept her rooted when Wesley's voice dropped, intimate and unguarded. His words came slowly, as if he were confessing a truth he had rehearsed in private. "I wish I met you before my wife," he said, not with cruelty, but with longing polished into sincerity. The sentence landed with a physical force, stealing the air from Marianne's lungs. Time thinned to that single line, the rest of the world dissolving into a blur of soundless motion. Daphne didn't flinch. She didn't correct him or remind him of boundaries. She smiled, a measured, satisfied curve that held no shame and no hesitation. They spoke then with startling clarity about themselves, about what they wanted and deserved, about how complications could be managed if courage was present. Marianne heard her own name mentioned not as a person, but as a circumstance, an obstacle to be navigated. The lack of remorse was louder than any insult. It revealed a calculus that placed desire above loyalty and ambition above decency, spoken calmly between two people who believed they were right. With hands trembling but resolve sharpening, Marianne reached for her phone and recorded fragments of the conversation, anchoring herself to evidence rather than emotion. Her breath shook, eyes burned, but her posture remained steady as she slipped away, unseen and unacknowledged. The sentence replayed in her mind, not as a wound to be nursed, but as a line of demarcation. Something essential had broken, not her spine, but her illusions. As she stepped into the night, Marianne understood that survival would require silence first, and that truth, once gathered, would need to be delivered with precision rather than fury. Marianne returned home that night wearing normalcy like armor. She answered Wesley's casual questions, laughed in the right places, and moved through their shared space with practiced calm while her mind assembled a war room behind her eyes. Sleep didn't come, strategy did. By morning, she had scheduled discreet conversations, coffee with Nora Keene framed as professional curiosity, a late walk with Rowan that sounded like sibling routine. She shared only what was necessary, choosing precision over confession. Silence, she realized, could be weaponized if sharpened correctly. Every document, every date, every unexplained transfer became a piece to be cataloged, not an emotion to be spilled. Nora's guidance was meticulous. She outlined forensic pathways that preserved legality while establishing intent, how to document patterns without tipping off counterparts, how to timestamp corroboration, how to avoid contaminating evidence through confrontation. Rowan added the legal lens, explaining how marital assets braided into development deals could turn separation into self-destruction if handled impulsively. Marianne learned that her marriage wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Leaving wrong could bury her under obligations she never consented to. Staying silent, for now, was not surrender, it was leverage. The realization steadied her, replacing grief with resolve. Silas Crown met Marianne once, briefly, at a quiet diner chosen for anonymity. He didn't flatter her courage or dramatize the situation. He spoke plainly about networks and reputations, about how Harriet Sloane's circle closed ranks when threatened. They protect momentum, he said, not people. He warned that exposure without scaffolding would rebound, elevating Wesley and Daphne while isolating Marianne as disruptive. Unless she flipped the board with verifiable truth, timed, contextualized, irrefutable. Marianne nodded, absorbing the cost. When she left, she felt the silence set its teeth. The next move would not be loud, but it would be decisive. Wesley and Daphne stopped pretending in the ways that mattered most, even if they still curated appearances. In select rooms, private dinners, investor-side lounges, invitation-only gatherings, they arrived together, not arm in arm but unmistakably aligned. The thrill of secrecy sharpened their confidence, the absence of remorse emboldened it. Daphne spoke openly about timing and destiny, framing the affair as inevitability rather than betrayal. Wesley nodded, buoyed by admiration that mirrored his ambition. They wanted themselves, and they wanted now. Anyone else, Marianne included, was reduced to logistics. The audacity of it spread quickly through whispers, carried by people who mistook boldness for honesty. Daphne escalated her campaign with surgical precision. She appeared where Marianne least expected her, at the gym after hours, at mutual friends' dinners, at charity planning meetings, always polite, always smiling, always cutting. Compliments landed like needles, casual remarks twisted context, and stories were told with omissions that painted Marianne as fragile and obstructive. Daphne never raised her voice or crossed an obvious line, she didn't need to. She let proximity do the work, letting doubt bloom quietly in shared spaces. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was erosion, the slow unmaking of credibility through repetition. Marianne responded by building, not reacting. She created a living archive, contracts aligned to calendars, transfers mapped to meetings, emails cross-referenced with public statements, invitations timestamped against asset movements. She documented access points, who scheduled what, who approved which invoices, who benefited from urgency. She did not hack, spy, or coerce. She preserved. Each file was duplicated and verified, each note written in neutral language. The work steadied her, transforming hurt into method. If truth were to matter, it would need scaffolding. And Marianne was done hoping that decency alone would carry the weight. Marianne proposed the compliance review with the calm confidence of someone offering help, not suspicion. She framed it as preparation, an internal stress test to reassure incoming investors and smooth questions before they arose. Wesley welcomed it, relieved to outsource scrutiny to someone he trusted and eager to appear transparent. Meetings were scheduled, access granted, and timelines agreed upon. Marianne moved deliberately, mirroring the company's processes back to themselves, documenting decision paths without altering them. The trap wasn't a surprise audit, it was a mirror, angled so that choices reflected clearly, without commentary, until the pattern spoke for itself. Harriet Sloane sensed the shift almost immediately. Calls went unanswered, emails arrived clipped and cautious. Within a week, an indirect message reached Marianne through a senior contact at her firm, concern dressed as advice, a reminder that careers were ecosystems and ecosystems punished disruption. The warning was polite, plausible, and unmistakable. Marianne acknowledged it without reaction, continuing the review exactly as scoped. She knew the danger of escalation. She also knew that deviation would validate the threat. The steadiness unnerved them. Pressure increased, not overtly, but through delays, rescheduled meetings, and sudden clarifications that tried to reshape the record. The breakthrough came late one evening as Marianne cross-referenced vendor invoices against event calendars. A catering line item appeared repeatedly at critical moments: premium pricing, expedited approvals, identical descriptors. The vendor traced back to Pearl Linwood's company. The payments aligned with Harriet's tightest negotiations, routed through events Daphne had organized. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a link, clean, consistent, and replicable. Influence money laundered as logistics, access disguised as service. Marianne sat back, breath steady, understanding the scope had widened. The mirror hadn't just reflected Wesley's choices, it had revealed the conduit. And conduits, once named, could be closed. The investor event was staged to celebrate momentum, not interrogate it. Polished presentations rolled across screens, applause arriving on cue as Wesley spoke with practiced assurance. Marianne took her seat among advisors and stakeholders, composed and observant, waiting for the precise moment when questions shifted from vision to verification. When it came, she didn't raise her voice or dramatize concern. She presented receipts, clean timelines, reconciled figures, and neutral explanations that connected decisions to outcomes. The room changed subtly as documents spoke where rhetoric could not. There was no accusation, only alignment, dates, transfers, approvals. Truth, delivered without heat, landed heavier than outrage ever could. Wesley attempted to redirect, suggesting misunderstanding and framing Marianne's findings as internal noise. But the record resisted him. His signature sat beside expedited clauses, emails confirmed urgency he had denied, approvals traced back to meetings he had publicly minimized. Harriet's composure cracked first, not in anger, but calculation, as she recognized the narrative slipping beyond control. Questions turned sharper, then specific. Responsibility settled where it belonged, not by declaration, but by evidence. The applause that had buoyed Wesley minutes earlier thinned into an uneasy hush. In that silence, the collapse began, not theatrical, but irrevocable. Daphne watched from the perimeter, stunned less by exposure than by Marianne's restraint. She had expected confrontation, emotion, spectacle, anything she could spin. Instead, she faced a woman who had played quiet with devastating accuracy. When Daphne spoke later, she offered no apology. She declared entitlement, insisting that ambition justified outcomes and that she deserved Wesley's attention. The room did not agree. Marianne didn't respond. She didn't need to. As people dispersed, alliances recalibrated, and reputations recalculated their distances, the private collapse continued, out of sight, but impossible to stop. The true rupture revealed itself not in the affair, nor even in the financial exposure, but in a document Marianne had uncovered weeks earlier and held in reserve. Quietly, methodically, she demonstrated how Wesley's ascent had been engineered using her professional identity, her credentials referenced in proposals, her compliance framework cited to reassure partners, without her consent. It wasn't a romantic betrayal alone, it was an ethical one that placed her legally adjacent to decisions she neither approved nor controlled. The room absorbed the implication slowly. Wesley's legitimacy had been scaffolded by Marianne's reputation, borrowed without permission. The cost wasn't just trust, it was liability. What no one anticipated was Marianne's countermeasure. She produced documented timelines and third-party attestations, Nora's contemporaneous notes, Silas's dated advisories, Rowan's legal memos that showed she had flagged risks, withheld approval, and erected safeguards months earlier. Her foresight insulated her from exposure while clarifying intent elsewhere. Harriet recognized the pivot instantly and recalculated, distancing herself from Wesley to preserve her own position. Daphne, sensing the tide turn, attempted to rewrite allegiances, offering selective disclosures to save her image. The scramble was unseemly and fast, alliances shedding like skin under pressure. Marianne remained steady through it all, refusing the theater of victory. She didn't gloat or accuse, she closed loops. Each question received a clear answer, each claim met a reference. When the dust settled, consequences aligned with actions rather than narratives. Wesley's authority fractured under scrutiny he could not deflect. Daphne's confidence dimmed when leverage evaporated. Harriet survived by retreat, diminished but intact. The twist wasn't spectacle, it was precision. And in that precision, Marianne reclaimed authorship of her life, not by shouting the truth, but by proving it beyond dispute. Marianne ended the marriage without ceremony, choosing clarity over spectacle. The paperwork was precise, the boundaries firm, the language unemotional. She reclaimed her name and disentangled herself from structures that had mistaken her silence for consent. There were no dramatic speeches, no public denunciations, only consequences applied evenly. Wesley's appeals arrived late and hollow, framed as misunderstandings rather than accountability. Marianne listened once, then declined further conversation. Closure, she learned, was not an apology received but a decision enforced. Walking away felt less like loss and more like alignment, a return to herself after months of strategic restraint. The lesson spread quietly through the people who had watched it unfold. Nora advanced with her integrity intact, trusted more deeply for having spoken only when evidence demanded it. Rowan returned to his cases with renewed conviction, reminded that patience paired with preparation could protect the vulnerable. Eloise watched her daughter rebuild with a steadiness that affirmed old wisdom: people show you who they are, and believing them early saves years. Even Silas took note, recalibrating his mentorship toward those who valued durability over speed. The ripple wasn't loud, but it was lasting, proof that ethical precision could outlast influence. Marianne's new life didn't announce itself with triumph, it arrived through choices that honored her values. She launched a finance-led coffee and bakery management venture, transparent books, fair contracts, community ethics, turning her long-held dream into a grounded enterprise. Mornings began again with runs by the river, evenings with ledgers balanced by choice rather than fear. She surrounded herself with people who valued character over applause and truth over timing. The story ended where it began, with order, but this time, it was chosen. And that choice, earned and protected, became her most enduring success. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time.